we're going to talk about interpreting expressions. There are two types of expressions we can have. One type of expression is called a numerical expression. Numerical expressions have numbers and mathematical symbols. The other type of expression we can have is what we call an algebraic expression. Algebraic expressions can have numbers and mathematical symbols, but they can also have letters in them. And you can see that here, 7 times j. This letter is called a variable, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. So when we talk about just a numerical expression, we'll often see the x symbol used for multiplication, like down here, 5 times x, or 5 times 6. But when we use variables, or when we have algebraic expressions, we're not going to use that x symbol. If I look at this expression, 7 times j, I'm not sure if this x is a multiplication symbol or if it's another variable. So when you have variables, you're not going to use your x symbol to show multiplication. You need to have other symbols that you can use. And there are 3 other ways we can show multiplication. The first way is using what we call a raised dot. Now this can be used for algebraic or numerical expressions. What we would do is we would take our 2 values, our 5 and our 6, and we would put a raised dot in between them to show multiplication. This says 5 times 6. And I can do the same thing if I have variables. This means 7 times j, and this means c times d. Now it's important when you use the raised dot that you make it so that it does not look like a decimal. Another option would be using parentheses. Okay? If we take our first value and we put parentheses around our second value, and we don't put any symbol here in between them, this means multiply 5 times 6. Now sometimes your second value will be in parentheses, sometimes your first value will be in parentheses, and sometimes they'll put both values in parentheses. As long as there's no addition, subtraction, multiplication, or division symbol between those 2 parentheses, it means multiply. The last way that we can show multiplication is by putting factors directly next to each other with no symbol in between them. Okay, so let's start with our algebraic expressions. If I take my 2 factors, 7j, put them side by side like this with no symbol in the middle, it means multiply, 7 times j. So this would mean c times d. Now, this won't work with a numeric expression. If I put these 2 factors side by side, there's no way for me to tell that this means 5 times 6. To me, it looks like 56. So that will not work for numerical expressions. Now, the last thing I want to do when we talk about expressions is just talk a little bit about vocabulary. The first vocabulary word you need to know is a term. A term is a number, a variable, a product or a quotient that's separated by addition or subtraction signs. In this case, we have a product of 2 times m. This is a term, and there's only one term because there's no addition or subtraction signs. In this expression, we have 2 terms. Okay? Our first term is the product of 5 times x, and the second term is just the number 14. In this expression, we have 3 terms. One's a quotient, one is just a variable, and one is a number. Now, we already talked about numerical and algebraic expressions, so let's just review that. Expressions are variables, numbers, and symbols that represent mathematical relationships. So the whole thing that we have here is our expression. We have variables, which we've talked about. Variables are letters that stand for unknown quantities. So when you look at your terms, any letters you see are your variables. And then finally, a new vocabulary word is a coefficient. The coefficient is the number that's in front of your variable. So when you look at 2 times m is your variable, so your coefficient is the number in front of it too. So 5 times x is the variable, the coefficient is 5. This problem over here has 2 tricky situations. The first is your y. It doesn't look like there's a coefficient in front of the y because there's no number there, but really there's a number 1 because we have 1y. And remember, when you have these 2 numbers side by side like this, It means multiplication, and 1 times y is just going to be y. That's why we can write it without actually listing the coefficient. Now the other one that's tricky is this x divided by 3. X divided by 3 is the same as 1/3 of x. So when we write it this way, we can clearly see that the coefficient of x is 1/3.